G'day everyone, I'm Mike, I use he, him pronouns, and welcome to another episode of Around the Hearth. This show draws on the experiences and play of the Open Hearth Gaming Community. We're an online gaming group which has a lot of different kinds of games and gaming, from story games to OSR to solo, and even more. I'll mention at the top of the show that we use safety tools for all play in the community because sometimes that pisses people off. And frankly, I want to identify those people early so they go away because I don't want to play with them. As usual, we brought on a pair of community members here to discuss their recent gaming and drill down into one RPG that they've played, read, or watched. And I am very grateful today to have Ethan and Gwen with me. Could I get you to introduce yourselves, starting with Ethan?
Hi, I'm Ethan. I guess I'm kind of an old timer on here now. I play a lot of games and occasionally run or more often facilitate GM-less games because I'm lazy. But I'm glad to be here talking to both of you this morning.
Very good. And Gwen?
Hi, I'm Gwen, pronoun she, her. I don't know if I'm an old timer. I mean, I'm an old timer in general at the Hearth. I only arrived last fall. I was in the Gauntlet community back in pre-pandemic, but I've returned or I've arrived recently. Happy to be here.
Welcome back. So for our first segment, we're going to go around and have everyone tell us about how their recent gaming has gone, what they've played or what they have coming up, and then talk with us about a particular game. So Gwen, what have you been playing?
So since arriving last fall, I did what I always do, which is I kind of jumped in with both feet into the deep end. So this is just this spring. I've played Trophy, Heart, a short run of Girl by Moonlight, Mouse Ritter, a lovely quarterly of Blades in the Dark with Lowell. I played Electric Bastion Land, Mythic Bastion Land, Lovecraft-esque, and 2 runs of Night Witches. One of those Night Witches games was a campaign that Brandon hacked for Battlestar Galactica, and that was a weekly. And then the other was a play-by-post game, actually, that Horse put on, and that was also delightful, both of which have since wrapped. And I think I'd want to be talking most about Night Witches. It was really interesting to get to play with the same community, not the same people, but the same community with the same kind of standards and quality I've come to expect from the Open Hearth. The same game in 2 very different modalities. So 2 ways in which these experiences differed. In the first, there was a live weekly game, but it was hacked to be in the Battlestar Galactica world. And instead of playing the Russian women pilots in World War II flying historic biplanes at night, which was a real historical event, we were Cylons who had defected to the human fleet and were fighting in a Cylon-only battalion on behalf of the humans against our former allies and fellows Cylons. So it was, instead of, if you will, focusing on the sexism and patriarchy, it was focusing on the sci-fi racism and kind of anthropocentrism, human supremacy. I don't know what exactly to call that form of prejudice, but that was very interesting. And the second run was the play-by-post run, and that was the classic setting in which we all played women, Russian pilots, dealing with patriarchy and scarcity of war. That historical setting versus fictional setting really kind of changed the tenor of the game more than I expected. What I found is that in the science fiction setting, we were all familiar with it. And so we all had our touchstones to go on based on having seen the show. But, it's a fictional universe, so the details are vague. I don't know what the inside of one of these kinds of vessels looks like exactly. I don't know exactly what kind of fuel it runs on. Things like that we could hand wave. Whereas in the historical setting, all of this is record. And we can get involved and invested as much or as little as we chose with that. And some of the players really engaged the historical facts. And they would talk about the neighborhoods in Moscow they were from, and they would talk about how exactly you might repair a damaged biplane, and the various wires that were involved. And I, being a technological naive person, didn't know anything about that. And I do research for a job. I don't want to do it for fun. So I just kind of went in as a naive player / character about the nature of the NKVD, the secret police and so on. But there are players who are very clearly engaged with it. And that just gave the whole game a very different kind of focus. I think that one thing that's interesting is setting a game in the historical setting like that. There's a little bit of a risk, but also a benefit. The risk is that you can get bogged down in those historical facts, right? And so rather than playing with the character, the narrative, the emotional beats, you're focusing on simulation, really. On the other hand, you have such a rich, the real world is the most interesting fictional setting you'll ever encounter because it is the most well fleshed out. So that's an advantage, I suppose. So that's an interesting kind of balance. Fortunately, my fellow players were great about that and didn't get lost in the weeds. But what surprised me about this dichotomy between two different settings is how much it informed and altered the emotional tenor of the game. I thought it would change just, the trapping. But with the historical setting, knowing that this really happened to women, because when you're feeling the emotional beats of your character, struggling with the scarcity of resources provided due to patriarchy, struggling with the direct sexism of the male superior officers, and then struggling with the real loss of life that occurred in fictional form in our game, but knowing that this is representing real people, it really lent a sense of tragedy to the game that I don't know. It's very difficult to capture, to kind of convey that depth of tragedy in a fictional setting. So that you might think, oh, play it in the real setting, you'll get a better experience. Well, not necessarily, because the fictional setting, on the other hand, allowed for more focus on the beats, the drama itself, the emotional element. It wasn't more sensational, it wasn't more melodramatic. I'm reaching for a word. It was almost like it was, we're playing with archetypes more. And so it was, in a sense, more of a pure narrative of these characters and character types interacting and struggling. And in that sense, it was almost like looking at an image where you've turned the saturation and contrast up. It's less realistic, but it's more intense in a way and pure. So there is this gritty, real, tragic emotional tenor to the historical setting, but then there's this more vibrant, not pure, simplistic, but also because of that, pure emotional feel of the sci-fi setting, which I was really surprised about. I think both are absolutely valid and I enjoyed both, but I didn't expect it to have such emotional distinction. On the other hand, I thought what would make the big difference emotionally or for the feel of the game was the modality played, namely live versus play by post. But that actually had less of an effect ultimately on the feel of the game, the meaning for me that I took from it. It did change the pace, of course, and B, the kind of the vehicle, right? For two reasons. One, a play by post game, you're not interacting face to face. We did do a session 0 face to face, or rather live on the internet. And we did do a couple check ins live. I think one in the middle and then one post mortem, so to speak. But for the most part, the game was played only via text, asynchronously, slowly, as play by post games are wont to be. That meant that the emotional stakes and the emotional connection among our characters took longer to grow, not just longer calendar wise, but even in the narrative. Whereas you can kind of establish, I have very clear memories of in Brandon's game, a character will come in and just I'm immediately making a judgment about that character and forming an emotional response. Because there was one character that oh, it was such a good performance. And the character was like a wheeler dealer, kind of a sleazy character at first. And so I immediately was like, oh, this guy, It's hard to get that for that to come across quite so palpably in text only. It can happen, of course, but it just takes longer to form some of those immediate bonds and reactions. But it happened. They were great writers. And so by mid game, it really felt that way. And the emotions got just as intense and just as meaningful to me. So it was a little slower burn, but it burned just as hot. The drama came a little easier live because you can kind of react to nonverbal cues. But the play by post allows for rumination and reflection and a more literary feel and style. And that's just as powerful in a different way. So, whereas I thought the different setting would be superficial, it actually did more for me emotionally than the different modalities made more difference, I should say. The different modalities were the superficial difference. Ultimately, the emotional beats felt similar, even if it was paced and presented differently. I've discovered from both plays that I love Night Witches very much. I love the focus on struggling with scarcity and the brutality of war. I've played lots of games in warlike environments and settings, and having never been in one myself, I do think it seems to capture an element of war that no other game really does. That sense of you always have three things you should be doing, but can only do two, which happens, often. You have to kind of make do. To quote a war criminal, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. That is the feeling that is viscerally conveyed in this game in a way I've never seen in any other game. But it's also got that like sapphic sisterhood, forming bonds with other femmes characters, and there's a subtext of kind of illicit lesbianism that can run through the game, where there's these women that are forming romantic relationships that are forbidden. Now, that was much more of a element clearly in the Russian historical setting, because in the sci-fi setting, the genders and representations were variable. It was about being Cylon versus human. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that Cylons and humans are visually, you can't tell immediately, right? So it was more about knowing identities than just representation. There are several situations where people at Cylons were passing as humans. And, I guess we could have developed that more and explored how that is and isn't different from gender, but we didn't really get into it too much. As a trans person, I did think several times about the concepts of passing and trans people in the past going stealth, so to speak. But I do, I always am a sucker for sapphic stuff. So I did enjoy that quite a bit. And then finally finding these glimmers of hope in just amidst tragedy and darkness as human connections. I think for me, it's important that a game like Night Witches does include those. For me, I can't do relentless, bleak, dark, grim tragedy. A game or a story, let's say like The Walking Dead, I just can't. It's too dark. It's too much. I'm a softie. I need my softie moments. The one thing that I'm not sure I've been thinking about, and I just don't have a decided opinion about whether it matters at all, and if it does, what it means, is the fact that I'm playing a game about sapphic women written by a cis man. I don't know if that matters, but it's just something that I've been thinking about, because I think it's important to think about that myself. Authorship, even though whatever. They say that there's been the death of the author, but not really. I don't think that's true. All right. I guess that's all I have to say about my Night Witches experience at the Open Hearth. It's been very interesting and rewarding. Honestly, both games in many ways. I said this to Brandon, and it was true. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's such a joy for me to come away from a game experience and know that I'm a better person because of the game, just like you can from a piece of art. That's what it felt like playing Night Witches.
Wow, that sounds absolutely amazing. And Night Witches has been on my list of games to play for some time. I own a copy. I think I've read it 15 times because it's actually quite an easy read, other than the heavy themes, but mechanically it's quite simple to read through. And the themes are so interesting in that historical context. Really, it is such a story and something that more people should be aware of. Ethan, have you played Night Witches, or do you have any questions for Gwen based on?
Yeah, I've played it 3 times. I played one sort of half a campaign of like the entire, or maybe a third. It was like 12 sessions. And then I played through Jim Cracker's year long, all the way through all of the duty stations game.
Oh, wow.
And I also played Rich Rogers' hack for Star Wars, which contrasted to when your sci-fi hack that you played, it worked as an adventure game. It was fun, but it did lack that pressure from both sides. Rich did attempt to put in some pressure from both sides, but it just didn't, there wasn't as much pressure. We played an all alien squadron, but like there wasn't as much humans versus aliens conflict as there was with the sexism and the resource pressure and time pressure as there is in Night Witches, like just the classic Night Witches. Also, I agree with you. It is one of the best written games I've ever seen. It's just so clear. There's never any question about what the rules are, what they're supposed to do. It has vibes, but it's very much clarity and function first, and the vibes are layered on top, which is how I like a game to be.
Awesome. Well, if anybody listening wants to run a game of Night Witches, I think you've got 3 players that are ready to jump in as soon as you put it up on the calendar.
I totally would play another campaign of it. It's a great game.
And if you just want to be a player, then ask in one of the Discord channels, and I'm certain there are GMs out there that are eager and waiting to run Night Witches for you. But we need to move on. Ethan, what have you been playing?
This has been actually a really light gaming year for me so far. But what I have played, this is apparently urban fantasy year for me. I have played in the past few months 2 different campaigns of Urban Shadows, an ongoing campaign of Lowell's work in progress game Sunken Hearts, and a short campaign of Fathom. I feel like Urban Shadows has been discussed to death by people who know a lot more about it than me. And the one I've enjoyed most is Sunken Hearts, but I don't know why it feels weird to talk about a campaign that's currently ongoing, but it does. So I'm going to talk about Fathom. To be clear, I enjoyed it a lot. I'm probably going to sound overly critical of it, but it's actually a really cool game and I recommend it. The system is a mashup of Forged in the Dark, the system behind Heart, the City Beneath It, Resistance, I think is what it's called. Maybe a little bit of Ironsworn. Mostly Heart is the big obvious influence. The action rolls use a dice pool like Forged in the Dark, but with D10s. You have a die to start with, a die for skill, a die for the domain, and then you subtract for the scale of risk and positioning. It has 5 levels of success instead of the 3 that are usually in Forged in the Dark and PBTA. There's a critical failure at 1, failure at 2 through 5, mixed success at 6 through 7, full success 8 through 9, and a critical success at 10. The stress and fallout work similar to Heart, but the fallout is looser. Instead of having a set list of possible fallouts, there's a list of categories of like types of fallouts, which I think is actually better. It has the abilities / moves like Heart. There's the major, minor, and zenith abilities. And the zenith abilities are kind of like the end of the story, the culmination of your character arc. It also has anchors, which I think are borrowed from Ironsworn. Maybe it's coincidentally ends up sort of like Ironsworn. They're associated NPCs or locations connected to your character that you can use to your advantage, you can interact with, you can improve them as you gain XP. There's like a list of, different improvements you can make. And you can kind of offload your stress onto them up to a certain point, at which point the relationship breaks because these people want nothing to do with you anymore. Which makes sense to me. Like that's a mechanic that reflects reality. It has not quite lore exactly, but it does have a set idea of how the world works and how magic, which is called the Unreal in the game, works. The fathoms that it's, named after are layers of abstraction from reality or differences from reality. They're, you're in the same place, but you see different things. Some things that are visible on some fathoms are not visible on others, or they appear in a different way, in some metaphorical way. And depending on what fathom you're on, the only mechanical difference is damage rolls do a lot more damage the higher your fathom is. So if you get in the Fathom where everything is just sort of colors and sounds and impressions, both the damage you do and the damage you take is a lot higher. Aside from that, the setting and factions that you build at the beginning is pretty open. But like it might be hard to say have an idea for a campaign and then decide to use Fathom to play it because of the Fathoms and the rules that go along with that, is because that is pretty baked into the mechanics and playbooks. Of course, both of the other urban fantasy games I've been playing have their own baked in assumptions about the world. I was initially going to say that Urban Shadows had the least, but that's not true at all. It's just that its assumptions are the ones you would expect in generic urban fantasy. The factions of vampires, werewolves, wizards all scheming against each other, that's assumed. Like there's no way you can play Urban Shadows without that. You just play a different game. So Fathom setting assumptions aren't any more restrictive. They're just different. They're outside of the vampire and werewolf setting. I think it's a little bit looser and less vibes enforcing than Heart, which I like. I like a game that has a lot of guidance early on and then gradually gets out of your way. Help me set up, help me get this world the way it's supposed to be, and then just kind of like the rules can be there if I need them. Fathom isn't that, but it's a lot more of that than Heart is. Like the Zenith abilities, for example, they keep it not on rails. They don't have a tight control over the overall plot, but it does keep your character on an arc if you want to engage with them. But you do have a choice between a few different Zenith abilities, and they require taking specific major abilities and anchors along the way. So you kind of have to pick one at the beginning and work toward it if you want to. You don't have to take one at all. I never did. I don't feel like my experience was bad because I didn't take it, but also it was a short campaign. The fallouts, like I said, are more just general categories of types of consequences that the GM is supposed to work from, rather than list like Heart's problems that are colorful and fun to think about, but sometimes really hard to apply in ways that make sense in the fiction. The Fathom fallouts, they're much more usable. They kind of come all the way back around to the GM moves to react to failures in, say, Dungeon World. And Fathom has GM moves and consequences, and I don't think all three of those are necessary. They're just sort of three different approaches for doing the same thing. But I was not GMing it, so it might work great when you're actually GMing it. The playbooks are similar to those in Heart, not just in structure, but they're like the Heart playbooks. They're weird and wacky. They don't fit standard, fantasy tropes well. They're very specific to this world. And also, like in Heart, the Zenith abilities mean that they come with a prescribed character arc. And some of them come with their own weird little subsystems contained within the playbook or within even a specific move within the playbook that are not at all connected to other playbooks' weird little subsystems. So if you don't want to learn an extra set of rules, you got to look through your playbook. Or if you do, if you want to get into the crunch, there are playbooks for you. I played the Cartographer, which is actually from a supplemental PDF called Strata by a different person. So I can't really speak too much about how the playbooks work in practice. I really liked the Cartographer character concept, but the minor abilities felt like just variations on the same thing. But that was not a core playbook. The other players did a lot of cool things with their playbooks. Yeah, I feel like I'm being way too critical of this game because I liked it. And it is a playtest version, so it's not going to be perfect. It's completely playable as is. My guess is that it's in that phase of development where the designer has added all the cool ideas they find in other games, and they haven't pared them back down and merged redundant ideas and integrated the different systems with each other. Or they've started that process, but they haven't quite finished it. The GM, Ian, did an amazing job. So did the other players. I think Ian has run it before, so it's hard to tell if there are rough edges from the game that would cause problems for somebody new to either Fathom or the systems it borrows from. But I think you could probably work around any problems that came up. It's a very cool idea. It's probably worth the effort, but I think it would take some effort to run it.
So there's a potential future diamond in there somewhere, but it still needs some polishing from the sounds of things.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a future diamond in it. The diamond is visible now, but you don't want to decide to run it next week, I don't think.
Fair enough. Gwen, have you played Fathom? Do you have any other questions for Ethan? Do you have a favorite urban fantasy game?
Oh wow. Such a great setup. No, I haven't played Fathom, and I mean now based on Ethan's description, I am going to go look it up because that's a fascinating mixture, right? I'm really interested in seeing how maybe this is the philosophy professor in me talking, how this degrees of abstraction from reality, how the fathoms work. What does that mean precisely, right? So I want to go dig into that and think about that. Favorite urban fantasies. I mean, I'm currently playing a play-by-post game of Urban Shadows, which is great. I think my favorite's got to be Monster Hearts, though, because although I do love urban fantasy, I love messy queers even more. So putting those two together is beautiful.
Awesome. Yeah, I am wildly intrigued by the concept of fathoms and how reality can be different and how that can have. And I know you mentioned a relatively minor mechanical impact, but it sounds like to abstract that even further, things get riskier or they swing more wildly. The kind of more abstract you go, that's an interesting premise for a system.
I kind of hope it ends up, in the final version having more mechanical impact. Because I feel like things should be more different depending on which fathom you're on.
Yeah, I could see different tables bringing in their own differences depending on different fathoms, but then that's not necessarily the system supporting you through that process. So more support from the system would be interesting. Maybe it could go into some of those cool zenith abilities or consequences.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. So I haven't played that many games in the last few months. I did play in a 3-session game of Pasión de la Noche with Gwen, was there for the very beginning. This is a playset for Pasión de las Pasiones. Forgive my pronunciation, I'm Australian. This was kind of, I guess, is this urban fantasy technically? Something very similar to that. It was kind of a gothic horror playset for Pasión de las Pasiones. This is the second time that I've played this game. The first time with this playset, the other time was with a completely different playset. And I love this, and I can't believe how much drama and interpersonal friction and kind of fireworks you get out of every single session. As I said, we played 3 sessions of this, I think, and it felt like we played it quarterly because so much happened so quickly between all of the different characters. Gwen, unfortunately, wasn't able to attend the final session, so her character got knocked down a well. But we did end the final session with a cliffhanger of a hand coming out of the well and grabbing hold of somebody. So maybe one day we'll find out what happened. I also played in a game called Chaos/Theory, which is a lasers and feelings hack that presents a Jurassic Park theme. This was a one-shot. It was a super silly game that we had an awful lot of fun with, coming up with ridiculous hybrid dinosaur creatures, including the terrifying Tyrannopotamus Rex, a Velocibeaver, the dreaded saber-toothed giraffe, which I got to tell you, did horrible things to people. That was an awful lot of fun and a great way to spend a single session. I played another single session game, which was the delightful Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. We played through the session Sal has written a play. This is a game with a continuous story, but you don't need to be there for every session. In fact, I've only played 1 session in the continuous story of these characters. It's really interesting to drop into an environment where you sort of pick up from the character sheet bits of context that you find interesting about the character that you're playing that have come from previous sessions, and then play through a session, and then at the end of that you can update the character sheet and leave some breadcrumbs for future players to play. I got to play Parish, the aging frog that was also a chef, that was in a play playing a captain of the guard that was also in love. That was a very bizarre Inception-like multi-level trying to become a character that was trying to be a character that was trying to confront their own sort of mortality situation. But absolutely delightful. If you see one of these Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast games on the Open Hearth, I highly recommend you check them out, because you can jump in for a single session and have a good time. But the game that I want to talk about today is we played a quarterly game of Impossible Landscapes using a hacked version of a hack of Cthulhu Dark. We were playing it in Cthulhu Dark using the occultation hack, and then apparently it was hacked to be less deadly, but I'm not sure if that was a subsequent third hack or if that was what occultation does. I haven't played any of those systems before, but they're relatively rules light. I'll dive into the system first before I dive into the meat of Impossible Landscapes itself. It's a rules-light system. So your character is, at the beginning of the game, made up of 3 kind of narrative elements, like a concept, sort of who they are, a trouble, something that is going to cause issues for that character, and then a conviction, something that they believe to be true, no matter what. And then during the game, whenever you need to ask a question or do something risky, you're going to roll a handful of d6s. You'll get 1 die if it's humanly possible, 1 die if one of your traits is helpful, and then you can roll your conviction die if you think that's relevant. The results are broken down into 3 tiers of success, so clean success, messy success, and failure. But if ever your conviction die rolls the highest, you have a chance that your character will move more towards ruin. And then I'm not sure if this is a Cthulhu Dark thing, an occultation thing, or the hack that we were doing on top of that, but we were all playing artists in this game. And so we all had artistic masterpieces that we were working on. So as we progressed towards ruin, our masterpieces got more complete. And they got to echo some of the creepy experiences that our characters were having. So that's enough about the system. I really want to dive into Impossible Landscapes, which I think was the true star here. If you haven't heard about it, there's been a ton of talk after a popular YouTube review was done recently of Impossible Landscapes. We were ironically playing before that started, so that was fun. Impossible Landscapes is a module for Delta Green, the Delta Green RPG. As I just said, we weren't playing it in Delta Green, so I'll talk about that in a bit. But I'll give you the publisher blurb, which is, "Fear is a fractal, and your world is a lie. A horror freed from an antique book reverberates through reality, shaking things, reordering them, and making them run like wax. Doors open to endless Victorian hallways where threats stalk the shadows on clockwork limbs, cold metal seeking the warmth of blood and bone. Madness pursues at every turn, baring its teeth to speak your name, and you can't escape because it's inside you. But don't despair. There is hope. A king waits for us. Beyond the tumble-down facade of the world, through the twists and tunnels of the human imagination, past the edge of everything sane, the king waits in the country of Carcosa, the place all madmen go. There, and only there, is the answer to everything. The last answer." So hopefully that gets you intrigued for what this is. It kind of doesn't really say, but there is this cursed book that has come into reality and infected everyone and everything it kind of comes into contact with, who then go on to spread that to other people and other places. And as that happens, reality kind of comes apart at the seams, especially for the people that have been impacted. So I mentioned we weren't playing Delta Green. One of the kind of primary conceits of Delta Green is usually you are some kind of government agent, maybe an FBI agent, maybe a military officer or something like that. And that wasn't the game we were interested in. We were playing as artists, which I think worked really well in to tie us more closely into the themes of Impossible Landscapes, which is about this cursed work of art and the impact it has on reality and other people it comes into contact with. So maybe there was a Delta Green somewhere in our story, but whatever was happening to them was happening off screen. So maybe there's another table that was running that story and our characters would pop in occasionally as a flash in the corner of somebody's eye. But we were all playing artists. We were playing an author, a designer of puppets, an architect, and a digital artist. So quite a broad spectrum of different art forms there. And being artists allowed us a lot of freedom for us to interpret the strange experiences we were having through the lenses of our own art medium. So every time the puppet designer sort of encountered something, they would interpret it in terms of puppetry and the way that puppets move and are created and how they work. And for the architect, it was all buildings. But that also allowed for the strange horror that we were being confronted with to be reflected back in our own art forms. So frequently we would be confronted with strange architecture or odd fractals or a cursed book or a strange sort of puppet NPC would show up and do something. And that sort of created a feedback loop that was really interesting to engage with. So yeah, I recommend if you're going to play this game, maybe play an artist. It's a good way to tie into the module. Now, I don't want to spoil too much about it because it is technically a mystery, and it's a thing probably best experienced rather than being explained. But there was a couple of points that I wanted to jump into from this game. First of all, the game started in 1995 in New York, but there was at one point a substantial time jump in the story, which is a thing that I haven't really experienced in most RPGs. And it was a really interesting kind of session that we had talking about the impact that that time jump had had on our characters, the relationships we'd gained, the relationships we'd lost, and the things that had changed along the way. It also really allowed us to demonstrate our characters' obsession with the central mystery and how it kind of consumed their lives even when they weren't actively looking into it. And I remember one very memorable phone call between two of our player characters where they were both lying to each other about being obsessed with the mystery whilst the camera was kind of looking at them and seeing their apartments and their walls covered in different clues and things. So that was quite an interesting time. You definitely need to come into this with characters that are invested in the mystery. They have to be actively engaged and have to be drawn into the mystery. But just like every other Delta Green thing I've ever encountered, if you as a player going into it are hoping that you are going to solve the mystery and save the day, maybe skip this one. Because, yeah, that is not the story being told here. This is a story of falling into ruin. The story itself unfurls into this complex web of interconnected clues played out across 4 different acts that have a tendency to refer back to things seemingly at random at first, but the more it happens, the more it all seems to form a picture. And the complexity of that web is such that I don't think any playthrough is ever going to find every single clue and every single connection. And that means every time you play through this, you're going to see different parts of what's going on, and that's going to inform your interpretation as to what the characters are experiencing. That works really well with cosmic horror, because with cosmic horror, if you understand it, it's boring and it stops being scary. But when it's huge and unknowable, that's when anything might happen at that point. And when those things start to happen, it becomes almost normal for things to be weird. And so when things are normal, that feels really weird and strange. Playing with a rules light system really allowed the module to shine through. We never got bogged down in the mechanics because we weren't rolling bureaucracy checks to see if we could find clues. We just sort of found them when it was important for the story. And in fact, we never got bogged down in the mechanics. We went whole sessions without rolling dice, which is a testament both to the story, but I think also to everyone at the table being so engaged with the characters and the story being told, and all just being cheerleaders for the inevitable ruin of our hapless heroes. I don't want to go too deep because I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but I did have a couple of highlights that I wanted to call out. One I don't have listed here is, in our first session, we found an NPC whose name matched the name of our GM, which we thought was a strange GM insert for him to do. Nope, that character's in the book, and they're named that. It just was a strange coincidence, and was one of the first ways that the cursed play managed to start to infect our own reality, I think. All of that makes sense in the context of the Delta Green universe and the story being told by Impossible Landscapes. But the ones I do have written down, so at one point our characters questioned whether or not they were dead, and then went on to question whether or not that even mattered. Because they were still there experiencing the story, so even if they had died, it's got to keep going, right? We did have at least one truly dizzying shift of narrative perspective that all of the players saw coming and managed to sort of guide their characters into that skid quite expertly. So that was a very fun session to kind of land at the end and have the sudden shocking reveal that we all knew was coming. But it played out perfectly. There were questions by the characters about predeterminism and whether or not non-participation in a system is rebellion if it was preordained that you would not participate. So it's very hard in a predeterministic system to rebel because maybe you were always going to, and that's part of the plan. We discovered that if you cut the strings of a dancing puppet, it will just complain that you made it harder to do the dance. And we spent a fair chunk of our campaign chasing down one particular NPC, and we caught up to them in the final session. And when we did, we had nothing to say to them. And that was an incredibly poignant moment because we realized that all the questions of how, what, when, where, why, none of that mattered anymore. Either we had the answer or the question was completely invalid by the time we got there. In short, I highly recommend Impossible Landscapes. It is one of the best cosmic horror things I've ever experienced. I'm not sure that I would recommend running it in Delta Green, but, grab Pasión de las Pasiones and run it in that. Give it a shot in some other system. Everyone that played in our campaign kind of got to the end and were talking about what systems they wanted to run it in because everybody wanted to run it. So, Gwen, Ethan, either of you have any questions about Impossible Landscapes?
Is everyone being an artist part of the module, or is that just a decision that you all made?
There was a decision made by Thomas, who was running the game, so it was part of the ad the ad for the game, when he put it up on the calendar, he wanted everyone to be artists because he wasn't interested in telling a story about FBI officers and CIA agents.
So I was wondering, how did your experience of this module differ or match the unnamed YouTube video, which I will ask you for later off the stream, because I'm not aware of this and I want to go watch it, and I'm going to play this game. I love cosmic horror. Was that review just like wildly off the mark, or do you think, oh yeah, very interesting?
So the review was broken down into two parts, and the first part was about Delta Green, and the second part was about Impossible Landscapes. So when the video first dropped, I watched the first part because I'm interested in Delta Green as a general idea, but not particularly interested in running it. And I was very interested in hearing this person's thoughts on Impossible Landscapes. So I did end up watching the video on Impossible Landscapes, and the reviewer loved it and talked about a lot of the same things. They did mention that as written, the ending is not as strong as it could be. But by the time you get there, it's funny because it's a story that kind of slides gently off the rails. And I think trying to run a railroaded game that is already going off the rails is quite difficult. So I think at that point, it's more important that you take the elements that your players have put into the game, touch back to scenes and NPCs and things that matter to them. That's the same in any of those sort of long form modules that try and tell this very compelling story. Ultimately, it's got to be about the player characters. Otherwise, why are you sort of telling that story? Make it unique for your table. So, moving on to our next segment, we ask everyone to talk about something they're really digging right now and why. This session's called Giving Me Life. So, Gwen, what is giving you life?
I'm going to cheat and say two things. I generally, like, if I had to pick my gaming soul, I would say that it's somewhere in the PBTA to OSR neighborhood. I definitely prefer mechanically light games that focus on narrative first. So right now, I am getting a lot of joy and life from playing a Gonzo OSR module with my real life face-to-face friend. It's called Raiding the Obsidian Keep by the Merry Mushmen. We're playing it in Old School Essentials. You can play it in any OSR game. It is a delightful point crawl that isn't particularly combat heavy, and it's much more about exploration and unexpected strangeness, which I just absolutely love. You know, there's a dungeon when you arrive in the bottom of the eponymous Obsidian Keep that is just every single little cell and room is just a delight. And it helps, of course, as always, that I have an exquisite group playing it with me, and the GM is born to run weird, gross, heavy metal influence strangeness. So it's been perfect. And then the other one is a play-by-post game. I'm playing a game of Thirsty Sword Lesbian, which has been absolutely magnificent. We're playing so if you look at Thirsty Sword Lesbian's website, they have a poweredbylesbians.com website that lists various settings you can play the game in. And we're playing the Queers of Castle Gay Skull, which is based on the She-Ra and the Princesses of Power cartoon, the new one, which is also just like a really dear, beloved show for me. And I didn't know this. It's play by post. We're all using our little online names. And of course, after we've been playing for a while, we have on a Discord server, we're chatting. And it ends up that half of us are trans and the rest of them are queer and something. So it's just been like, oh, of course. It's just been such a rich, in this game, our characters are doing the normal PBTA, Thirsty Sword Lesbian stuff, but we're also exploring like what it would mean to do all of that in the context of like forming a polycule and, exploring the relationship dynamics that occur in that sort of environment, plus fighting. So it's been really exciting and fun and just so much silly, queer nonsense. So those two have been really, I don't know, feeding my soul.
Awesome. And Ethan, what is giving you life?
So the other day, I watched a new YouTube show called Mount Mystic Rangers. It's sort of a mockumentary workplace comedy show about employees at a national park. It is silly and absurd, but it's also you can tell the people, at least some of the people involved in this show, know the real world stuff the show is based on and are deviating from it in fun ways on purpose instead of starting from like a general cultural idea of what it's like. There's something about the location and the general vibe that it's very grounded, even though it is a very silly show. So I might be the perfect audience for it. I wrote a playset for my game Unincorporated called Vigil Creek Nature Preserve, where you play the staff at a park where weird, possibly supernatural things are happening. And this show is exactly what that playset is meant to do. So it struck me, in a way just because of that. But also, it only has one episode. It does feel like a first episode. It's clearly a labor of love. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops.
I've definitely had the experience of sitting down with a PBTA rulebook whilst watching a TV show and picking out the moves that they're doing on screen as that's happening. I have never done it with a game I've designed, so that must be a very bizarre experience. So for me, late last year, the fifth book in the Stormlight Archive was due to be released by Brandon Sanderson. And so about this time a year ago, I committed to reading the first 4 books of the Stormlight Archive, which start out ridiculously long and just get longer as they go on. And I managed to rope one of my friends into reading it with me, and he was a first-time reader. So I had read all the books before, but he hadn't. So I was rereading and he was reading, and we sort of set a reading schedule. And so we managed to catch up in time to read book 5 of the Stormlight Archive, which is not the end of the series. It will be a 10-book series by the time it's finished. So I managed to rope him into that situation. But also, the Stormlight Archive is set in a shared universe with a bunch of other Brandon Sanderson novels. The shared universe is referred to as the Cosmere. So we've just kept going and reading all of the other books in the Cosmere. And as of tomorrow, we have 2 books to go. So we will have, in about 14 months, read all 16 novels, a handful of short stories, a bunch of novellas. And it has been an absolute blast to introduce something that I have a lot of love for and that I spend time theory crafting about and, getting the corkboard with the red string out and trying to make up theories, and to be able to introduce that to someone else who hasn't experienced that before. And so I can kind of ask questions, trying not to be too leading in my questions, just to try and draw out of them, like, what are you thinking here? What do you think is happening? And at the same time, rereading a series where everything, that there's little hints and interconnected pieces of a broader story that's being told across all of these works of art. And on a reread, because now you have the more context, you can pick out all of the clues that you sort of missed the first time. So an excellent first read and an amazing second read. If anybody wants to get into Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, I can tell you how to get the first one free. And we'll get you hooked on it. And listeners, that's our show for this episode. Gwen, tell people where you can be found. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experiences with us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's been a joy to talk about this stuff and more importantly, to hear. I've got a little list of things I'm going to go and check out. You can find me on Blue Sky and Discord under Dr. Gwen Marshall, all one word. You can look at my writing under my full name, Gwendolyn Marshall, on Drive Through RPG. Gwen Marshall, because I'm inconsistent on itch. And send me a message.
Awesome. And thank you as well, Ethan, for sharing your experiences with us today. And where can people find you?
I'm Cave Dweller with a U instead of a W on Blue Sky and Discord. Cave Dweller at dice.camp on Mastodon, though I'm not there very often. And I'm just Ethan Harvey on itch, where I have a few games up that, like Fathom, are playtest versions that need to be updated, but I've been told are fun to play as is.
Okay, and if anyone's looking for me, you can find Coda Mike on that Discord for the Open Hearth. So the Open Hearth podcast is a production of the Open Hearth Gaming Community. We have an online gaming calendar where folks can sign up for sessions. If you've enjoyed this show, consider supporting our Patreon at patreon.com/openhearthgaming. We have a Discord. We are on Blue Sky, Tumblr, and Mastodon. Dice.camp. I don't even know what that is. You can find out more about all of that at openhearthgaming.com. Please consider rating, subscribing, and reviewing our show. It really helps us out. Gwen, Ethan, thank you, and I hope to see you around the hearth.